Good evening, everyone. My name is Claire Haley. I'm the Vice President of Public Relations and Programs here at Atlanta History Center. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual author talk this evening, featuring author Brian Matthew Jordan. He will be discussing his book, A Thousand May Fall, An Immigrant Regiment's Civil War. The paperback of that is just out, so if you haven't yet gotten your copy of the book, my colleague Monique will be posting a link where you can do that. It's 25% off tonight from Atlanta History Center's museum shop. We offer domestic US shipping or free in-store pickup if you're in the Atlanta area. So we'll hope that you'll support Atlanta History Center and support Brian by purchasing a copy of the book tonight. He's going to be giving a brief presentation, and then he'll be followed in conversation with Gordon Jones. Gordon is a senior military historian here at Atlanta History Center. He most recently curated our exhibition Cyclorama, The Big Picture, which I'm sure many of you in the audience have seen. Brian Matthew Jordan is our featured author. He's an associate professor of history at Sam Houston State University. His first book, Marching Home, Union Veterans and Their Unending Civil War, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History, and he lives in Willis, Texas. Brian, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you so much, Claire, for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here this evening. I'm most grateful to have the opportunity to talk with you about my most recent book, A Thousand May Fall. At the heart of this book are the men of the 107th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, an ethnically German regiment mustered from a dozen northeastern Ohio counties during the dark days of the Civil War's second summer. Very nearly 70% of the men on its muster rolls were ethnically German or foreign-born. While immigrant soldiers, of course, were hardly unknown in Lincoln's armies, more than 200,000 ethnic Germans would don United States blue between 1861 and 1865. Units in which foreign-born soldiers outnumbered native men were actually somewhat rare. The 107th Ohio was one of only 30 ethnic regiments among the more than 3,500 military organizations that comprised the United States armies during the Civil War. But though language and identity set them apart, the men of the 107th Ohio weathered the numbing human ordeal of the war in some ordinary ways. They were men betwixt and between, men who belonged but did not. They whipsawed between heroism and heartbreak, duty and dereliction, cynicism and conviction. They endured the war's extremes, shivering in squalls of snow at Brook Station in Virginia and flagging under the fevers of Folly Island in South Carolina. They swatted at gluttonous mosquitoes in camp and navigated treacherous roads on the march. They battled treasonous rebels at the front and then exchanged taunts with contemptuous civilians back home, resisting with equal vigor both Republican radicalism and Democratic defeatism. They knew the taste of victory, participating alongside the famous fighting 54th Massachusetts Regiment in a rail-twisting raid that projected them into the heart of the Palmetto State at war's end. But more often than not, they felt the ache of defeat. Indeed, the 107th Ohio lost half of its strength in two successive outings at Chancellorsville and at Gettysburg. When the survivors returned north, they tended to the onerous errands of memory and to the agonies of the many chronically sick and wounded, diseased, disabled men among them. They took pride in their pain, insisted that they maintained a monopoly on misfortune. Hard luck and treachery, both real and imagined, sharpened the unit's understanding of their service and of the war. These are not the kinds of Civil War soldiers that many Americans have come to know. Reassuring histories have exaggerated Billy Yank's courage, pluck, and determination, while still another body of scholarship has worked to foreground the Union soldiers' anguish, misery, and woe. Both views, to be sure, have revealed a lot about Civil War soldiers. They have equally effaced, I think, the war's lived complexities, positing narratives of progress or declension, but ultimately fail to capture the murk and muck of life in camp and on the march, the urgent human demands of carrying on, standing guard, putting one foot in front of the other, the satisfaction of having suffered, sacrificed, and somehow survived. By recovering how a particular community of men navigated the many mercurial demands of war, regimental histories are, I think, ideal vessels for rendering a more complete, a more capacious, and ultimately a more inclusive narrative of our nation's deadliest conflict. One that maps the liminal space between ennobling narratives and lived realities. Regimental histories can retrieve something of how the war was actually felt, intuited, and experienced. Now, many modern readers will regard A Thousand May Fall as a contribution to the so-called new military history, because it moves us beyond questions of tactics and strategy to probe the larger culture and society that shaped and informed the men and the fighting in the first place. But perhaps more accurately, the book revives a very old kind of military history. The regimental, after all, was really the first genre of writing about the Civil War. Hoping to preserve and contextualize something of their experiences, hundreds of veterans took up their pens and produced unit histories in the decades after the conflict. A recent count by the Library of Congress tallies more than 700 federal regimental histories. Among these veteran authors was one Jacob Smith, an ambulance wagon driver for the 107th Ohio, who hoped tellingly as late as 1910 that something of the toils, dangers, labor, and hardships of soldiers in the Civil War might finally wind its way into print. Regimentals indeed were carefully considered, amply documented, finely grained, often very painstaking accounts of how the Civil War annexed ordinary lives and communities. They stood in rather sharp contrast to more popular accounts that looked back nostalgically on the conflict, that sterilized and segregated its violence. Evoking the spirit of these early unit histories, then, A Thousand May Fall rummages around snowy winter camps, trundles along dusty roads, and prowls along distant picket lines to reveal how real people on the ground negotiated the war and its long aftermath. Its pages teem with men who sometimes faltered, often struggled to maintain hope, and not infrequently wondered whether the war effort was worth it after all. By centering such men in the narrative frame, we can, I think, begin to map something of the Civil War's human topography. A retelling of the 107th Ohio service in the Civil War develops at least three arguments. First, the war's spaces, places, and environments shaped soldiers' attitudes toward the war and informed their emerging understanding of the conflict. Tramping across starkly militarized landscapes awakened men to war's earnest realities, while zagging along miles of trenches and makeshift forts impressed upon them something of the war's enormous scale. As they swung picks and spades and muscled logs onto corduroy roads, the men acquired a new, more capacious understanding of the war's scope, scale, and complexity. Equipped with this new understanding, brought into contact with men from different regions and different races, they measured the physical and metaphorical distance between the home front and the battlefield. Secondly, and not unrelatedly, experiences between battles and behind the lines did as much, if not more, to inform regimental identity. Though we often recount war as an unbroken sequence of battles and military campaigns, the war from the soldier's perspective amounted to long stretches of strategic inactivity, punctuated by only the occasional rendezvous with the enemy, engagements that themselves remained shrouded in the proverbial fog of war. Indeed, Civil War soldiers spent much more time in camp and on the march than they did in battle. And it should follow, naturally, that these experiences proved crucial to their morale, to their motivation, to their sense of unit pride and identity. Third, and finally, the war continued to annex the lives of survivors and their families, who together grappled to escape the conflict's long shadow. Even those who returned to lead meaningful and civically engaged lives suffered quietly with the legacies of the conflict. Ugly wounds prevented Frank Rothermel from opening his mouth more than a third of an inch, Theobald Hasman from raising his hands above his head, Peter Scheib from extending his arm. A shell wound not only deafened Lanson McKinney, a bricklayer from Stark County, but left his face badly disfigured. The war was something indelibly inscribed on their bodies, something they were never able again to escape. The loss of pre-war trades and independence and mobility afflicted still others in a society where one's capacity for manual labor proved a marker of manhood. More than a few of this regiment's veterans ended their days in the wards of state insane asylums and poorhouses. In short, the war went on. For the men of the 107th Ohio, that war began at Camp Cleveland, a sprawling training complex sited on about 50 acres immediately south of its namesake city on September the 9th, 1862. The unit's enlistment motivations defy any neat categorization. Some saw in the Secession War a continuation of the failed democratic revolutions of 1848, an opportunity to fight Smith-Siegel and strike at slavery and the slaveholding aristocracy. In defiance of their elders, a dozen young men from Zor, a communitarian society on the Tuscarawas River, stole away in the night, persuaded that their pacifism was no longer practical in an abolition crusade. For others, though, pecuniary inducements appealed more powerfully than patriotism. Whatever their motivation, some 994 men, Democrats and Republicans alike, answered the regiment's first roll call. With fewer than 3 weeks of training under their belt plates and shoddy Austrian muskets on their shoulders, the 107th Ohio set out on their first assignment. Earlier that summer, a Confederate raid had looped to within 60 miles of Cincinnati. And though the immediate threat to the city had passed, Ohio's Governor David Todd would nod his newest recruits into the earthen works coiled about Cincinnati and Covington, Kentucky, in an effort to reassure the Queen City's yet uneasy denizens of their security. If the care with which 21-year-old John Brunny, a regimental musician in the 107th, described it is any indication, the unit's first march in Kentucky proved a formative episode. At first, things moved forward, accompanied by song, he explained. Then the temperatures rose and the haversacks grew heavy. Muscles became sore. Thirst set in. Cursing officers struggled to keep the men in the ranks as they lost courage and collapsed along the side of the road. This first march invited the 107th Ohio to reconsider its naive optimism, to distinguish between cowardice and straggling. Further, when it was revealed that the unit had spent its entire day marching in circles, that its intended destination could have been reached in but an hour, men were led to question openly both the perspicacity of their leaders and to reflect on some of the base absurdities of war. Still more taxing marches would await the men once they were transferred to the seat of the conflict's Eastern Theater in the Old Dominion that autumn. Roads caked in a thick porridge like muck arrested the Army's progress in the winter of 1862 to 63, supplying an uncomfortably apt metaphor for the progress of federal arms. Aimless bustle invited skepticism, or in the case of Burnside's Mud March, in which artillery chests and lumber wagons were swallowed up to their axles in thick mud, humiliation. The Buckeyes, for their part, settled in for a long winter north of the Rappahannock River, shivering in squalls of snow and ice as waves of dysentery and diarrhea and typhoid made their deadly romps through the ranks. The winter of 1862 to 63, it proved didactic. Operational historians have long recognized that the months the Army of the Potomac spent moored in Stafford County amounted to a strategic pause, a prized period for troops to rest and resupply. But less fully appreciated is the extent to which that encampment invited sustained reflection among the enlisted men, both about their participation in the war and the peace movement that was then rapidly gaining adherents on the northern home front. Indeed, the winter encampment of 1862 to 63 coincided neatly with the ascendancy of the anti-war Copperhead Democrats, whose leading exponent, the Dayton area Congressman Clement Laird Vallandigham, took to the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives to deliver an anti-abolition, anti-war tirade, the very day the 107th Ohio trudged to its new campsite at Brook Station. Throughout the North, many Republicans predictably decried Democratic defeatism. Nowhere did the opposition to Copperheadism blaze with more righteous indignation than in the camps of the 107th Ohio. From their makeshift winter huts, the men ratified resolutions expressing their desire to see the war prosecuted through to a vigorous conclusion. If they don't want us to come down here and fight, one of the unit's enlisted men recommended, or let them keep their mouths shut and not disturb us. I will leave my bones to bleach on the battlefields of the sunny South, he retorted, before I will say compromise or enough. Idealizing their shivering, their suffering, and their sacrifices, the men of the regiment invited a contrast between their own martial masculinity and the unmanly agitation of the so-called stay-at-homes. Some of the men even expressed their desire to engage the Copperheads in open combat. In a rather remarkable editorial, one private proposed to send some of our weather-beaten soldiers home, armed with a gun and a bayonet and 60 rounds of cartridges. Halfway business is about played out, Christian Schreiner explained. It would be a deplorable thing if civil war should break out within the North, but if it cannot be avoided in any other way than by yielding to the Copperheads and the Mudsill rebels, I say let it come. The coincidence of anti-war opposition on the northern home front, together with these restless months of immobility, helped to clarify exactly what was at stake in the war, promoting an ironic sort of unity within the rank and file, within the fractious, politically fractious Army of the Potomac. The more the Copperheads rave, Schreiner resolved, the more determined the men in this army get. There is an army pride growing up, even now in full existence, that will make it irresistible, explained one enlisted man brigaded with the 107th. And what is very important, that pride will place the Army entirely beyond the influence of Copperheadism at home. That renewed sense of strength and unity would be sharply tested, however, when the Army of the Potomac finally engaged Robert E. Lee's men at Chancellorsville, the first 3 days of May 1863. For its part, the 107th Ohio shook out into a line of battle at the Tally Farm along the Orange Plank Road, holding the extreme right of the 11th Corps, which in turn held the extreme right of the entire Union Army. Throughout the morning of May the 2nd, 1863, reports about an ominous buildup of enemy soldiers on the extreme right flank proliferated at Army headquarters. But even so, nothing could have prepared the men for the force of the blow that was about to be delivered just after 5 o'clock by Stonewall Jackson's troops. Jackson's 26,000 rebels had stolen through the tangled scrub of a second-growth Virginia forest on a dozen-mile march that would deliver them to the exposed end of the Union line. It was sheer pandemonium. The bullets, Christian Reicher marveled, the bullets just whistled by my head like a real hailstorm. The men squeezed their triggers and stood as long as a stand could be made before falling back in full retreat. If we'd remained 5 minutes longer, the Ohioans' breathless lieutenant colonel insisted, we all should have been killed or taken prisoner. As it was, the regiment's baptism of fire had inflicted staggering losses. The Confederates had killed, wounded, or bagged as Richmond bound prisoners some 220 men. Even the regimental surgeon, the old 48er Charles Hartman, was killed, a fate that would have deleterious consequences for ailing veterans pursuing their pension claims and in need of his affidavit after the war. Chancellorsville, it's also fair to say, visited great psychological damage upon the unit. Almost immediately after the battle, Gottfried Kappel of Company I began to manifest symptoms of what some soldiers would tantalizingly call nervous fever, a malady that quickly became, in their words, epidemic. An infirmity with the name nervous deafness placed at least one soldier from Company G on the sick rolls. Citing his feeble state of health and the perilous condition of his company, as well as the recent trials and hardships to which the regiment had been subjected in the late battles of Chancellorsville, Hamilton Starkweather resigned his first lieutenant's commission right on the spot. Indeed, it seemed to many as though the world had stopped the moment those long lines of rebels emerged from the woods. Frantic minds lurched between scenes hastily remembered and half recorded, the rush of events mocking any sense of chronology or scale. Men routinely confessed their inability to translate their memories of battle into lucid or linear prose. If I were to write it at all, Reicher explained to his sister, I would need almost a week in which to write. One regimental surgeon in the 107th Ohio's brigade apologized for what he called the scattershot quality of his letters home. I've had so much on my mind, he explained, that I can hardly direct my thoughts from pressing matters of business long enough to write a connected epistle. For one volunteer, the battle endured in memory not as an event with a discrete chronology, but rather as a jarring soundscape, a fiendish yell, a crackling hell of musketry, the bellowing of mules, the agonized shrieks of wounded horses. The events of that afternoon had rushed along at a furious, even dizzying pace. There's no such thing as time on a battlefield, one enlisted man gasped. Now, though the collapse of the 11th Corps line, complete as though it was, in no way preordained the Federal Army's crushing defeat at Chancellorsville, Northern newspapers would effortlessly seize upon the so-called stampede of these ethnically German outfits in the 11th Corps as the devastating battle's decisive moment, cleverly effacing the failure of native-born leadership that had provoked the crisis in the first place, cleverly effacing the opportunity that Joe Hooker had to win the Battle of Chancellorsville on May the 3rd. Threats, entreaties, and orders of commanders were of no avail, the daily national intelligencer seethed from the nation's capital. Thousands of these cowards threw down their guns and soon streamed toward the rear, toward headquarters. For weeks, the false-hearted allegations, embroidered with an ugly nativism, would annex Northern newspaper columns. Only months then, after indicting the Copperheads for their own cowardly misdeeds, 107th Ohio found itself in the surreal position of responding to allegations of cowardly conduct heaped upon their own. In answering these charges, the men would further organize their ideas about courage, about manhood, about the nature of sacrifice in war. I saw a letter yesterday from home, Lieutenant John Winkler reported, stating a report that our company left the battlefield and ran at the first appearance of the rebels without firing a shot. In an impassioned letter addressed to the editor of the Worcester Republican, his hometown newspaper, a Wayne County soldier explained that it was his duty to inform our friends at home of the facts. We went forth to do battle for the Union and the Constitution, Winkler wrote, and we want to be used decently and not abused. The men painstakingly cataloged the battle's human destruction, wielding with pride their lengthy casualty registers as evidence of a brief yet hopeless stand. The memory of noble men gone to their graves and now languishing in the hospitals, another correspondent from the 107th added, is entitled to this plain, unvarnished statement of fact. The ethnic soldiers of the 11th Corps, the struggle to establish what had happened along the Orange Turnpike would prove nearly as trying as the battle itself. But in this fight, they would enlist the support of the larger German-American community. From Manhattan to Cleveland, mass meetings assembled to rebuke the calumniators. At the Cooper Institute in New York, Friedrich Kopp, an ethnically German refugee who had penned several stirring accounts of Hessian contributions to the American Revolution, leveraged his authority as a historian to denounce the defamation of the Union cause. The defamation of the 11th Corps is altogether dangerous to the Union cause. I never knew a soldier, he explained, who was willing to fight the enemy in the front when his comrades or the people for whom he fights stand ready to stab him from the back. The 107th Ohio then had scarcely taken inventory of the tragedy that had befallen them at Chancellorsville. And 2 months later, they once more found themselves in the throes of the killing. In the wake of his tactical masterpiece at Chancellorsville, Robert E. Lee grew hubristic, impatient to resume the offensive. He soon drew his Army of Northern Virginia into Pennsylvania in a second northern invasion. As the Army of the Potomac felt its way north to check the enemy's invasion, doubts and anxieties began to crowd out whatever confidence the soldiers had regained in recent weeks. In a camp near Emmitsburg, Maryland, on the evening of June the 30th, 1863, intuiting that another engagement was imminent, a soldier who had resisted Jackson's flank attack slipped into a mournful trance. I stood leaning against a camp stake, gazing dreamily across the hill, with mind reverting to Chancellorsville, filled with the anticipations of a second edition so soon to be issued. In his sad reverie, this veteran was once again amid the carnage, surrounded by gleaming bayonets and staggering wounded, tormented by piercing cries of mangled combatants. He was prophetic. For the very next morning, a meeting engagement metamorphosed into the war's bloodiest battle. At the Double Quick, the 107th Ohio tore from Maryland into Pennsylvania and through Gettysburg, now a perfect picture of bedlam. They tore through the borough to its northern fringes, where they were stacked on the campus of the Adams County Almshouse. They'd no more caught their collective breath when an intrepid young division commander, 28-year-old Harvard valedictorian Francis Channing Barlow, beckoned them to brace a beleaguered Union brigade planted atop a subtle rise called Blocker's Knoll. Atop that forlorn hill, the Ohioans would hold the tip of a sharp salient that jutted into the enemy position against very long odds. We stood our ground, vowed Jacob Borroway, and shot as fast as we could. The Stark County volunteer managed to squeeze off 3 rounds before a shell knocked his musket from his hands and broke it all to pieces. Before long, the federal line collapsed under the converging fire of swarming Georgians in a repeat of Chancellorsville. The Ohioans instinctively abandoned the deadly perch to which they never should have advanced, offering whatever resistance they could as they scrambled to the rear. Back at the almshouse, the 107th Ohio's adjutant gripped the regimental colors in a daring attempt to rally the dazed remnants of the regiment. The retreat was harrowing, but it was especially so for the unit's ambulance detail, obliged to wind wagons heaping with wounded and injured men through the confused, gnarled masses congesting the borough's streets. For the second time in as many battles, the 107th Ohio had been thrashed. Of the 458 men who entered the fight that morning, no more than 171 limped to the unit's new position behind a low stone fence atop East Cemetery Hill. There, another bloody fight awaited on the second day of the battle. In that twilight action which swirled desperately around well-poised federal batteries, the Ohioans and their brigade repulsed the Louisiana Tigers, secured the anchor of the Union fishhook, and set up the cataclysmic battle's final day. It was an almost unimaginable feat, an unimaginable performance for a unit that had been so badly handled just hours before. Save the occasional crack of a Confederate sharpshooter's rifle, the 107th Ohio would not come under fire on July the 3rd. The men would instead listen with nervous anxiety as the cannonade preceding Pickett's charge yielded first to the distant rattle of musketry, and then to another restless night under arms, and finally to an orchestra of human misery. Shrill cries and heartrending groans supplying the only serenade on this 4th of July, the 87th birthday of a once United States. Regimental Postmaster Alfred Reicher, detailed to the 11th Corps Field Hospital at the George and Elizabeth Spangler Farm, actually wore through the soles of his brogans, tracking back and forth between the haymows and the regiment, supplying urgent updates about grievously wounded men. After Gettysburg, in a move that seemingly confirmed the pejorative assessments of ethnic soldiers heaped upon these men by Northern society, Army headquarters would yield to popular sentiments and abolish the 11th Corps. In August of 1863, the 107th Ohio was detached from the Army of the Potomac and whisked to the war's margins, made to pass its last 21 months marking time and conducting garrison duties in swampy South Carolina and Florida. Moored in exotic camps far from home, subjected to mindless drill and monotonous fatigue duties, the men betrayed their dejection and gloom in their letters and diaries. We looked every hour upon the same naked beaches of sand, one enlisted man explained, the same drooping palmettos. Unable to escape the thought that they had been consigned to irrelevance, the troops no longer shined their shoes or folded their gum blankets or polished their muskets. Deprived of the opportunity to battle the enemy, they instead chronicled their campaigns against sand fleas and scorpions, wood ticks and mosquitoes. In this way, they could continue to suffer and indeed even bleed on behalf of the cause. Most, though, just wanted the war to be over. Though several companies dutifully marked their ballots for President Lincoln in November of 1864, a plurality cast their votes for his opponent, George McClellan, believing that the young Napoleon was likelier than old Abe to end the war. They were the only Ohio unit to deliver a victory to Lincoln's Democratic opponent. "It is strange," remarked one patronizing Connecticut soldier who had fought alongside the Ohioans at Chancellorsville and Gettysburg, that men who have endured so many hardships, who periled so much for their country, should be so blind and ignorant to try to support that which is working to destroy all the good that they have ever accomplished. On the mossy islands of South Carolina, then, as for the rest of their lives, the men shouldered the burden of Chancellorsville. Bad conduct on the part of the Dutch has been so strongly impressed upon the native soldiers and upon the public, one veteran conjectured, that I doubt it will ever be eradicated and our character ever restored. Nor did it help matters that the regiment's finest hour of combat, a sprite skirmish along the stout banks of Turkey Creek near Sumter, South Carolina, an action that earned Private Henry Finkenbinner a Medal of Honor, came on Sunday, April the 9th, 1865, at the precise hour that Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant in Wilmer McLean's parlor. The memory of the fight at Dingle's Mill and the expedition that followed, liberating no fewer than 5,000 enslaved persons and delivering the war to a corner of the Confederacy that had scarcely known it, would be eclipsed by the events in Virginia and later in Washington. After the war, the regiment's survivors lamented nothing more than having to hear frequently slurs, thrown even by men who call themselves comrades. Segregation from the larger community of Union veterans reinforced their conviction that they were somehow uniquely unfortunate. So too did the cynicism of prying pension examiners, who looked skeptically upon pension claims for exposure to the elements and the effects of tropical climes. In their pension applications, made all the more difficult by the nature of their service, the veterans rehearsed their story as a pageantry of woe. Neither convinced they had climbed to the snowy heights of honor, nor were entirely ready to concede that the war had been some irredeemable folly. They instead fused pain and pride into a singular interpretation of the conflict. Loss and anguish were, for even the most sentimental and nostalgic among the veterans, fundamental to the war's meaning. Tainted with the stigma of cowardice, the 107th drew attention to its terrible record of slaughter, eager to attest that it had battled no less manfully than native-born men. But because 20th century narratives of the Civil War had such little patience for agony and misgiving, they had no room for these or most other ethnic soldiers. Narratives of loyalty and suffering proved no match for tales stained by nativism and sentimentality. The Civil War instead became urgently our war, a backyard scrimmage fought between brothers, not a human contest waged by many immigrant soldiers. Today, the men of the 107th Ohio then are hardly known, even in the counties and communities that first sent them off to war. Copies of the original regimental history produced by ambulance wagon driver Smith remain scarce, tattered heirlooms long forgotten. I've never in thought or word regretted what little I had done for my country in the way of duty, Smith wrote in the conclusion to that tome, again published in 1910. But I've always been proud that I'd taken some humble part in the great strife. Confident, yet self-conscious, acknowledging the yawning void between the war he waged and the war his adopted nation preferred to imagine. The old soldier, I think, had penned a most fitting epitaph for his regiment. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Brian. That was enthralling, as is your book. And I must say, I was very much impressed by your book because it's not the same kind of old school regimental history that so many of us are used to. It's new, it's fresh, it's great storytelling, it's great writing, but with a context. And so it's, it seems more of a case study than a regimental history. This really is the new history, the new military history, as you're saying. I am curious about one thing, and I suspect some others might be too, and that is the title of your book, which is derived from the 91st Psalm. And if you will permit me, I'm going to just read that portion for everybody. 91st Psalm. 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. But you will only observe with your eyes and see the punishment of the wicked. Why did you select that as your title?
So that psalm was quoted in a letter that was written by Christian Reicher back home to his sister in Zor. Christian Reicher was one of those dozen men who stole away from this pacifist communitarian society in Northeast Ohio, set aside his pacifism, went off to join the war, and turned to his faith, turned to his religion as a way to sustain him through just this unbelievable slaughter. He wrote this in the letter in which he reports to his sister the events at Chancellorsville. And I think it gets to the heart of one of the stories that I want to tell in the book, which is about the human endurance of these men. We often take for granted, right, that they were able to accomplish these things. And I think what you get when you turn to a regimental history, when you turn to this kind of fine-grained case study, it's impressed upon you that, of course, nothing in the past is inevitable, and that just getting from point A to point B, just surviving, just enduring the marches, the environmental conditions, the physical and the mental stress of the war, that took an incredible, just an incredible act of faith, both in a theological sense and in a metaphorical sense. And I think that quote from Reicher really gets to the heart of the project that's at the center of this book on mapping the human topography of our fratricidal war.
That is fascinating. I found that whole story about the Zor community, placing patriotism versus religious faith, and so I was just fascinated that you used that as your title. I'm also understanding that you first came into this story through the story of Seraphim Meyer, the colonel of the 107th. Could you tell us a little bit about his story and how that got this whole thing started for you?
Sure. So more than a decade ago now, I was asked to prepare an essay for a volume on cowardice in the Civil War. And I was asked to write about the only federal colonel who was court-martialed for cowardice as a result of the Battle of Gettysburg. Of course, that's Seraphim Meyer, the colonel of the 107th. He's a fascinating character. He was a ardent pre-war Democrat, had actually been one of Ohio's electors in 1860 for Stephen Douglas. And then when the war breaks out, like so many across the North, he sets aside his partisan loyalties and joins the Republican Party, joins the Union recruitment effort in Northeastern Ohio, and then is rewarded in the summer of 1862 with the colonelcy of the 107th, with a dearth of military experience. He goes off to war with one of his sons, Edward Meyer, who was the captain of Company C of the 107th. They fight together at Chancellorsville, and Seraphim Meyer at Chancellorsville watches as, of course, his unit is surrounded, the unit is enveloped, and he watches as his son is struck by an enemy bullet, is wounded. Seraphim Meyer believes mortally wounded. He then is captured and is kind of taken helplessly to the rear, having witnessed what he believes is his son's final moments, sent off to a 6-week unhappy sojourn in Libby Prison in Richmond. Just an absolutely unimaginable moment for any father, right? To not only have the shame and the stigma of having your unit face this reverse at Chancellorsville, but then to believe that you've helplessly stood by while your son has been killed right before you. Happily, Edward Meyer was not, he was wounded, but not mortally. And Meyer would be exchanged. He'd return to Ohio. He would discover this happy news, and the two would go back off to fight in time for the Battle of Gettysburg. At Gettysburg, and I've poured through the court-martial records when I wrote this initial essay that led me into this unit. There's lots of good eyewitness testimony, both from within the regiment and from outside of the regiment. I believe that, right, the conditions on July the 1st are remarkably similar to what happened at Chancellorsville. They're deployed on the extreme right of an overextended Union line against swarming Confederates that are going to quickly envelop them. Civil War soldiers, right, they carried those experiences forward with them to subsequent battles, something we often miss. And I think in that moment, he has a flashback to Chancellorsville, becomes completely flooded with emotion. He abandons the unit, falls back into the borough of Gettysburg, abandons them in this moment of great chaos, is court-martialed and sent off to the indignity of a court-martial trial. The verdict of that trial is thrown out on a minor technicality, which of course is the worst kind of circumstance for Meyer, because he's never really fully cleared of that charge. But it's a reminder, right? Previous historians who looked at this, right, it looked at cowardice in a very black and white way. And I think, again, reaching below and getting to know the community of men adds this human element that really helps to explain and contextualize his actions there on July the 1st, and it helps to tell us something about the culture and character of Civil War soldiers more broadly.
Yeah, I think that's one of your most powerful passages in there, is that description. And, I was really left with the sense of just shock and horror, to where if I had not read those passages, I would not have made as much sense out of your argument about Meyer and the flashback. Mm-hmm. You're talking about community of soldiers. We have a question that just came in, and this is, I think, also gets to the heart of your story. This listener wants to know how many of these guys were related? Were they cousins, brothers? Were they, family members, as we often hear with soldiers going off to war? And then what kind of background in terms of, are they professionals? Are they shopkeepers, farmers? Anybody have any military experience?
Mm-hmm. Great questions. There are a few relatives, a few pairs of brothers, and then obviously Seraphim Meyer and his son would be the most prominent example of blood relations within the unit. In terms of the occupations, very diverse. Most of these men, the ethnic soldiers, were those who kind of came over in a wave of ethnically German immigration in the early 1850s. They'd planted some professional roots in Northeast Ohio. They were stone cutters and cabinet makers. Some were engaged in farming. Others were engaged in white collar professions too. A lot of these men came out of the Turner clubs, right, in Cleveland and in Sandusky. So just a broad array of professions, and a wide array of ages too, ranging from the youngest enlistee at 16 all the way up to some who volunteered in their early 40s, which is of course ancient by Civil War standards. So, and that too, I think, again, is another window into the usefulness and the utility of a new unit history. We're sometimes so taken by making sweeping generalizations about these armies, but even when you get down into a unit, even when you're looking at 994 men, there's just great diversity, division between and among them, politically, socially, theologically. So that's helps to restore some of the messiness that we can often face with big national studies.
So now, what were the Turner clubs?
So the Turner clubs was a movement of, would be sort of similar to gymnastics, right? It was a focus on kind of aggressive athleticism, and there was the view that this sort of athleticism would lead to self-perfection and in turn societal perfection. This is the belief, and they became very powerful clubs that were also related to the anti-slavery movement in many places, had a close relationship with a lot of the old 48ers. Charles Hartman, the regimental surgeon, was very active on the anti-slavery circuit, and active in the Turner clubs as well. So it was this belief that you had to train yourself through physical exertion and suffering, and that too, I think that kind of cultural experience kind of predisposes some of the conclusions that the men of the 107th would draw about their service, that they were somehow uniquely unfortunate. It's not a surprise that they foreground their suffering and their anguish the way that they do.
So I think a lot of times when we think about German soldiers in the American Civil War, we think about the 48ers. We think about a strong emancipation leanings and views, but that's not really the case here. This is a much broader, deeper story.
That's absolutely right. I mean, we think of, that all these German American soldiers are Carl Schurz, right? And it's important for us to remember that these German immigrants who come over in the 1850s, many of them remain loyal to the Democratic Party, and they remain deeply skeptical of the new Republican Party because they believe that the Republican Party had dallied too closely with the nativist Know-Nothing Party, and that they had invited the Know-Nothings into this broad anti-slavery coalition. And even if they were kind of broadly anti-slavery and saw a threat to self-government in the Confederate aristocracy, they were deeply suspicious of the Republican Party. So I think the 107th helps to amplify that voice of the democratic, capital D democratic German American immigrant that's often lost and in our broader stereotypes.
Thank you. I'm gonna switch gears here. We just have a question about military history, and this is a good one. We're talking about the disaster at Blockers Knoll, the collapse of the 11th Corps at Chancellorsville. So, do you think there's any what's the practical lessons that we might take from that that the infantry could have adopted after that to perform better in battle?
The practical lessons, well, one would be an improvement in the native-born leadership, and in both cases, right? The 107th fell under the sway of some terrible division commanders, and military historians are divided, of course, on the performance of Barlow as a division commander at Gettysburg, or some of the division commanders, Schurz at Chancellorsville. But I think it's fair to say that there is just a dearth of good leadership at the divisional level that prompted both of those crises. Of course, Chancellorsville, we often point to as Lee's great victory. I think it's something of a Pyrrhic victory for him. I always point out to my undergraduate students that, here Lee wins the Battle of Chancellorsville with his impressive tactical feat and turns Hooker's plan in upon itself, but loses a fifth of his army in the process, right? And the same is true of the Confederate tactical victory at Gettysburg on July the 1st. It turns out to be a pretty Pyrrhic victory, as the 11th Corps will retreat to the key high ground immediately south of the borough at Cemetery Hill, which becomes the anchor of their most enviable defensive line of the Eastern Theater of the whole war. So I think there is a lesson here about leadership at the divisional level, and about, and frankly, Barlow too, is somebody who, just didn't have a lot of respect for these ethnic soldiers. And if anyone has read about Barlow's letters, have been published and are widely accessible, and he has just no respect for these outright resentment for the ethnic soldiers in his unit. So there's a lesson there as well, I think.
In that sense, it's kind of a microcosm of the Army of the Potomac in general. It's not the soldiers, it's the leadership.
That's right.
and the gaining of that experience as the war went on.
Yeah.
I got one last audience question here for you, and that was essentially summarize for us again how immigrants, not just Germans, but immigrants, unique identities, as foreign born, not native to the United States born. How did that influence their views of the Civil War and more importantly, their regimental identity? So am I asking you to go beyond Germans and talk about some other groups as well?
So one of the great historiographical debates that the book attempts to intervene in is this question of, did Civil War service for immigrant soldiers, did it promote Americanization, or did it move in the other direction? And there are scholars who have argued on both sides that yes, Civil War service was a way to Americanize these men. There are others, Christian Keller among them, most prominently, who have argued that it actually may have retarded the process. And I kind of come in on Keller's side of that issue. Certainly for the Germans, I think it held things back. They remained segregated from the larger community of veterans. And in part, I think that's because these immigrant soldiers understood keenly what was at stake in the war, and they held to their ideological conviction throughout the late 19th century at a time when native-born Americans wanted to turn away from the ideological moorings of the war. These immigrant groups, right, they understand this war, the secession war, as for some it's a crusade against slavery, but for others it's about the fate of self-government. It's about the fate of democracy around the globe, which it's easy for us to forget from our perspective today. Democracy is on the run, right? And these democratic revolutions have been thwarted and foiled across Europe. Great Britain and France are chortling at the young United States, tearing itself apart after just 8 decades. You thought you were going to be able to govern yourselves, right? And see that only leads to this kind of bloody civil war. That's what's at stake, right? It's still, as Lincoln says, the last best hope of Earth. And union has a tangible meaning. It's deeply wrapped up in notions of economic progress and freedom and liberty. And the immigrants cling to that view, and they make the connection between, right, slavery and democracy, that this is not only a war for union, but it's a war about making a union worth saving. And sadly, they're kind of on the fringes during the war, and then after, as Americans come together and reconcile, right, we don't want to talk about those sorts of things. We can't have this be a great contest over slavery or democracy, because then we'll have to assign guilt or blame. And so they remain outliers. And I think it's absolutely crucial that we restore that immigrant's voice and amplify it, and not just think about it as the Civil War as a brother's quarrel, but think about the reality that, of course, 10% of these armies are African Americans, some free, many formerly enslaved or freedom-seeking enslaved persons, and then you've got another 25%, right, that are Irish, that are German, that are coming from beyond national borders. So that's fully 35% of the Union armies aren't the standard stock stereotypical white, Midwestern farm boys that we often think fought the Civil War. That's incredibly important. And that helps to contextualize this war, not just as our struggle over democracy at a time when we realize how fragile democracy is, but it helps to make this war truly an international event, and it was.
Thank you, Brian. That is a great cap on this talk. We're brushing up on the top of the hour, and I'm just going to say one thing before handing it over to Claire, and that is, before we got on this call, Brian tells me that his next great project, he has been asked to write the new single volume synthesis of the Civil War to essentially update James McPherson's classic Battle Cry of Freedom from 1988. That is a huge undertaking, but bottom line is we have not heard the last from Brian. So stay tuned, my friends, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Gordon.
Thank you so much, Brian and Gordon. And to everyone in the audience, thank you for attending tonight. If you found tonight's talk interesting, don't worry, there's lots more to explore that Brian wasn't even able to scratch the surface of in the book. Again, it's 1,000 May Fall and Immigrant Regiment Civil War. It is available for purchase from Atlanta History Center's museum shop, newly out in paperback if that's your preference, also of course available in hardcover. And tomorrow night, we have another author talk coming up again right here on Zoom. This one has been kind of a long time coming. We had a COVID printing delay, and then we had a weather delay. So we're really excited for it to finally be happening. We'll be hearing from Sam Quinones for his newest book, The Least of Us. So that's tomorrow night on Zoom. You can find that free registration information at atlantahistorycenter.com. Again, thank you for joining us. Brian, Gordon, thank you both so much. And to everyone in the audience, we hope you have a safe and wonderful rest of your week.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Good night.
Night.